Donald Trump is asking Americans to trust his instincts, while those instincts are now putting two major US alliances under pressure at the same time. In roughly 20 hours, he threatened Oman over negotiations with Iran and publicly questioned military exercises with South Korea while praising Kim Jong Un as respectful and unthreatening. That is not a minor messaging problem. It is a test of whether personal relationships and presidential impulse are beginning to override the strategic commitments the United States has spent decades building. And the evidence here forces one central question. Is this actually a coherent strategy, or are American allies, troops, and military resources being forced to absorb the cost of decisions made on the fly? Start with Oman, because the contradiction is almost impossible to miss. In a phone interview with Fox News, Trump was asked about talks involving Iran and Oman concerning the Strait of Hormuz. His response, according to the material we have, was blunt. If Oman gets in the way, the United States would bomb it. Think about what that means. Oman is not simply some hostile actor appearing out of nowhere. The United States relies on access and cooperation in Oman as part of its military posture in the region. So the president is publicly threatening a country whose facilities and cooperation matter to American security, while the United States is already engaged in a draining conflict with Iran. Now, there may be a defense of this. A president sometimes uses extreme language as leverage. Trump's supporters have argued for years that unpredictability can make adversaries hesitate because they cannot be certain where the line is. But that theory has a basic requirement. Your allies still need to know that you understand who they are and why the relationship matters. If the threat itself creates doubt about whether Washington distinguishes a partner from an adversary, unpredictability stops looking like leverage and starts looking like strategic confusion. And that gives us the first standard worth applying. If a Democratic president threatened a security partner during sensitive regional negotiations, would Republicans accept he's just being unpredictable as a sufficient explanation? And if the parties were reversed, would Democrats? The standard cannot depend on whether you like the person holding the office. The question is whether presidential threats increase American leverage or make American commitments less credible. Trump publicly complained about long-standing joint military exercises with South Korea and described them as an inappropriate and hostile signal toward North Korea. He praised Kim Jong Un for treating him with respect. That is the President of the United States placing personal treatment by an authoritarian leader into the middle of a security relationship with a treaty ally. And the source material adds another detail that makes this more serious. North Korea's military capabilities have not stood still. Its nuclear and missile programs have continued to advance, and North Korean troops have fought alongside Russia in Ukraine, with concerns that Pyongyang is receiving Russian military technology in return. This is where the history from Trump's own first administration matters, but only because it tells us that this concern is not coming exclusively from his political opponents. NBC News reported that Rex Tillerson, Trump's first Secretary of State, referred to him as an effing moron after a national security meeting. CNN later reported extraordinarily harsh comments from former Chief of Staff John Kelly, who described Trump's dishonesty and the transactional nature of his relationships in deeply critical terms. Those statements do not prove that every decision Trump makes is wrong. Personal judgments are not evidence of strategic failure by themselves. But they do matter when the exact weakness those former senior officials described, a highly personal transactional approach, appears to match the structure of the decisions we are watching now. Look at the sequence. Trump's first-term diplomacy with Kim Jong Un produced historic meetings and enormous publicity, but the core security objective was denuclearization, and the material before us does not show that North Korea surrendered its nuclear capability. Instead, its missile and nuclear programs advanced. Now Trump is again emphasizing his personal relationship with Kim while questioning exercises designed to reassure and prepare South Korea. That is a measurable gap between the symbolism of the relationship and the security result. And South Korea has choices. If Seoul begins to believe that American protection depends less on durable commitments than on the president's personal feelings toward Kim Jong Un, the incentive to diversify its security relationships grows. The source material explicitly raises the possibility that South Korea could move closer to China. Whether that actually happens is uncertain, but the risk itself matters because alliances work partly through confidence. Once allies start planning around the possibility that Washington may not be there, the alliance can weaken before any formal treaty is ever changed. According to reporting cited in the material, part of the THAAD missile defense capability associated with the Korean theater has already been moved toward the Middle East because of the Iran conflict. That means a war in one region is not staying in one region. It is pulling resources from another theater where the United States faces a nuclear-armed North Korea and a rising China. And the Washington Post reporting cited here says the US supply of a drone important to monitoring and defending the Strait of Hormuz has fallen by roughly 25% during the Iran war. That number is important because military power is not a speech, it is inventory, it is maintenance, it is trained personnel. It is ships in the right place, aircraft available when needed, missile defense systems positioned where planners expect them, and surveillance assets that have not been consumed faster than they can be replaced. A president can sound maximally aggressive in public, while the underlying military options are becoming narrower. This is exactly the kind of political information problem that can trap people on every side. A dramatic quote is easy to repeat. The harder job is tracing the claim to the underlying record and asking what it actually proves. That is why I created Don't Get Played, the evidence discipline for American politics. It helps you move from reacting to testing using tools like the evidence ladder and source dependence tracing. The complete digital ebook is only $9 one time. Open the description and click the first link to get your copy for $9. The same purchase link is in the first pinned comment. The next provocative political claim will arrive quickly. Now use that same discipline on the military picture. The source material describes another development that should get much more attention. The last U.S. aircraft carrier based in Japan leaving the region, described as the first such absence since the 1970s. If that reporting is accurate, it is not proof that the United States has abandoned Japan, Taiwan, or South Korea. We should not overstate it. Force posture changes for many reasons, but in combination with the movement of missile defense resources and Trump's public criticism of exercises with Seoul, it creates a pattern that allies cannot simply ignore. And this is where presidential rhetoric becomes operational. If you are a South Korean defense planner, you do not have the luxury of assuming every presidential statement is theater. Your job is to prepare for what happens if the words become policy. If you are a Japanese planner watching a carrier leave the region while US resources are consumed elsewhere, you have to ask what capabilities will actually be available in a crisis. If you are an American service member, the issue is even more direct. Political decisions determine where you deploy, how long you remain there, and what risks you are asked to carry. The strongest fair defense is that presidents are elected to make decisions, not to be controlled by unelected advisors. Trump can reasonably argue that voters chose his approach precisely because they wanted him to reject the foreign policy consensus, question old alliances, pressure partners to contribute more, and negotiate directly with leaders previous administrations treated as untouchable. There is nothing inherently illegitimate about changing strategy. Alliances are not sacred objects that can never be reassessed. Military deployments are not permanent laws of nature. But that defense creates an obligation, not an escape hatch. If you are going to unwind or rewrite decades of strategy, you need to show what replaces it. What concrete concession did Kim Jong Un make in exchange for reduced pressure? What does South Korea gain from fewer exercises? How does threatening Oman improve the US position against Iran? How does moving defensive capability from Asia to the Middle East leave America better prepared if another crisis erupts? And how are depleted surveillance or weapons stocks being restored? This is the reflection that matters most after hearing the best defense. How much strategic disruption should a president be allowed to call negotiating leverage before the administration has to show measurable gains? The answer cannot be never disrupt anything, but it also cannot be trust the president indefinitely. The same test applies to Oman. Maybe Trump's threat was intended to scare negotiators away from an outcome he dislikes. Fine. Then the measurable question is whether it improves the negotiation. Does Oman become more cooperative? Does Iran make a concession? Does American access become safer? Or does a public threat make a useful intermediary less willing to work with Washington? We do not yet have enough evidence in the supplied record to answer those outcome questions. That uncertainty needs to remain uncertainty, and it is important to say what this evidence does not establish. It does not establish that Trump intends to abandon South Korea formally. It does not establish that every military movement is caused by presidential incompetence. It does not establish that Oman will break with Washington. It does not establish that the United States has no military options left in the Middle East or Asia. Those would be stronger claims than the material supports. What the record does establish is narrower and still serious. Trump publicly questioned a core element of military cooperation with South Korea while praising Kim Jong Un. He threatened Oman in the context of negotiations involving Iran. US military resources are being strained by the Iran conflict, with reporting of important surveillance inventory falling and defensive assets being shifted across theaters. And people who served at the highest levels of Trump's first administration previously warned in unusually blunt terms about the personal and transactional way he approached national security. Because there is a deeper danger here. Alliances are deterrence mechanisms. They are supposed to convince an adversary that attacking one country will trigger a predictable response from others. If an adversary starts believing that the response depends on whether its leader has personally flattered the American president, deterrence becomes harder to calculate, and uncertainty can cut both ways. Sometimes uncertainty scares an adversary away. Sometimes it convinces an adversary that this is the moment to test the system. That is why the madman theory of leadership is so seductive and so dangerous to evaluate. If nothing bad happens, supporters can say the unpredictability worked. If an ally panics, they can say the ally needed to be pressured. If an adversary escalates, they can say the president now has justification to hit harder. A theory that explains every possible outcome after the fact is very difficult to falsify. The only responsible way to judge it is to define results in advance, reduce threats, stronger alliances, concrete concessions, sustainable military readiness, and lower risk to Americans. There is a human consequence hidden inside all this strategy talk. When leaders treat alliances as personal relationships, military personnel still have to execute the resulting policy. Families still deal with deployments, sailors still go to sea, air defense crews still operate the systems, intelligence personnel still monitor the threats, South Koreans and Japanese citizens still live inside the range calculations. The president gets to improvise publicly. Millions of other people have to plan their lives around whether that improvisation becomes policy. So here is the consistency test I would use. If you would condemn a president from the other party for threatening a partner, praising an adversary because that adversary showed personal respect, shifting scarce military resources between simultaneous crises, and then offering no clear public metric for success, you should not lower that standard because the president is on your side. And if you would defend those actions under another president, then you should be able to explain the strategic benefit here without relying on personality. The central question was whether we are watching a coherent strategy or American power being forced to absorb decisions made on the fly, based only on the record we have. There is not enough evidence to prove that every move is improvised. Presidents can pursue strategies that are not publicly disclosed in full. But there is substantial evidence of a dangerous mismatch between the administration's confident rhetoric and the costs accumulating underneath it. Strained inventories, shifted defenses, uncertainty among allies, and public praise for an adversary whose military capabilities continue to grow. That mismatch is the finding. The uncertainty is whether Trump can turn the disruption into concrete concessions before the costs become harder to reverse. The responsibility sits with the president and the senior officials empowered to advise him because they are the ones deciding whether threats become policy, where military resources move, and what assurances allies receive. What happens next should be judged by results, not by whether the next statement sounds tougher than the last one. And the broader lesson is about evidence. Political theater works when the public mistakes confidence for proof and personality for strategy. The next claim, clip, poll, court filing, statistic, or synthetic video will demand a reaction before this controversy is even forgotten. Don't Get Played gives you a repeatable way to move from reacting to testing and from borrowing certainty to earning it. The digital ebook is $9 one time. The link is in the description and the first pinned comment. Open the description and click the first link to get your copy for $9. Strong convictions deserve evidence strong enough to defend them. Accountability begins when we judge power by the record, not the performance.